Hi there, it's Beefy. Welcome back for the second installment on how to build an impossible triangle. If you haven't watched the first video, then I suggest that you watch that first, because everything in this video is relevant to that. In the last video, I showed you how to build the impossible triangle and how to animate the material using the default UVW mapping in a texture tag. Today, I want to extend on this and show you how to animate a ball along the surfaces of the triangle. We'll be using an align to spline tag, which I'm sure we've all used by now, so no surprises there. But I want to explain how I built my spline. It's pretty easy. More importantly, I want to show you an easy way to calculate the keyframe values for rotating the ball. There are plenty of espresso tutorials out there that show you how to rotate a wheel or ball when animating along the spline. For this animation though, that's going to be overkill, and the method I will show you is way easier and quicker to work out. So on top of all that, I want to pop into Redshift and Octane and show you how I lit my scene. This will be relevant to last week's tutorial too. We're going to render out a Cryptomatte, which is vital for the ball animation, because we need to create a mask in After Effects. And I will show you how to composite this all together in After Effects too. Also, I want to explain the differences in isometric projection in Redshift and Octane. Octane isn't intuitive to say the least, but once you get a hang of it, then it's going to be useful for you down the road. There's going to be lots of moving parts to this tutorial, so I'm going to create chapters so it's easy for you to jump to the information that you need. But before we crack on, I would like to take the opportunity to welcome new viewers. If this is your first time here, then this is the place where I post tutorials, tips and other stuff. I'm just sharing the knowledge that I picked up along the way. Hopefully it will help you in the future. If you're into Cinema 4D, After Effects, Illustrator and the like, then why not subscribe today and tinkle that notification bell so you won't miss out on future content. You have nothing to lose. And a big shout out for everyone who has subscribed and liked my videos. You guys are awesome. So without further ado, let's dive into this. Okay, so I just jumped into Cinema 4D and I'm using Cinema 4D R25, so my interface will look different to yours if you're using another version of Cinema 4D. But if you're well versed in your version of Cinema 4D, then you shouldn't have any problems in following along. So the tool that we're going to be using today is going to be the World tool. So if you press Shift C, you can do a search for the World tool and then you can just dock that into your interface and that will save you some time down the road. Apart from that, we're just going to be using the normal tools for this tutorial. So this is how we left our tutorial in the last video, and we have our material. So that's animating on the default UVW mapping in the texture tag. And what I'm going to be showing you today is how to animate a ball along this spline. It's going to be relatively easy. I just want to show you how I made my spline, and also I'm going to show you how to work out the keyframe values for rotating the ball. So first of all, I put all my faces into a null here. So I'm just going to hide this, but first I'm going to take the first face. I'm going to drag that out and I'm just going to drop this into the archive here. And the other thing I'm going to need is the original spline that we created to make the geometry in the first place. So I'm just going to take this. I named this Penrose spline in the last tutorial. You might have named it something different, but I'm just going to drag that out and I'm just going to hide the archive there. So these are the two things that we need. So I'll just come into the side view. As you can see, this is a side view of our geometry and our spline. So this is the spline that's highlighted and this is the geometry here. Now we're going to have to create another spline because this curve here doesn't match the curve here. So I'm just going to make sure I'm in model mode and I'm just going to raise that spline up by 25 centimeters on the Y. Hold down Shift for increments and there you go. You can see now that, so this curve here doesn't match the curve on the geometry. We're going to create a new spline using the geometry. Okay, so we're going to be using this part of the new spline down this end, and then we're going to be using the other end of the original Penrose spline. So I'm just going to turn that off for the moment. And I've just got the geometry showing here, and I'm just going to jump into the default view. And if I just come out of the camera, we can see what we're working with here. And if you remember in the last tutorial, we selected some extra polygons down here on the curve. And this is for when we animate a ball or any other object. So we'll be able to cast some shadows and reflections onto the ball as it comes around the curve here. This is to make sure that the object that we're animating isn't appearing in midair and then onto the geometry. So I'm just going to get rid of this texture tag here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come into edge mode and I'm going to select the loop selection. Just make sure that I've got my face selected there. So I just selected my loop selection, which is UL on the keyboard. And I'm just going to make a selection on this edge here. And for a side note, in the last tutorial, when I was making these selections, in R25, this is what you're going to select. And you have a little bit more control with the loop selection. And in early versions of Cinema 4D, you may actually select all the edges of the object. So once you select your spline and you select edge to spline, you just need to delete the extra points that you don't need. I know it's a bit of a pain, but it's there's no way around it, I'm afraid. But any problems, just drop me a line and I'll give you a hand. So this is the edge that I want to select here. So I'm just going to right click and say edge to spline. And I'm just going to pull that out. I'm going to hide the face for the moment. And we're going to come back into the side view. And I'm going to pop into point mode. So this is our spline here. So I'm just going to make a selection from this end. So as we come around the curve onto the straight, I'm going to be making a selection around about here. So I'm going to create a rectangle selection. And I'm just going to delete these points at this end. Now I'm going to bring back the Penrose spline. And I'm going to make sure I have that selected. So this curve here, I'm just going to delete this curve here. So I'm just going to delete these. And now we have our two splines that we need. So we're in line on the Y, because I raised the Penrose spline up 25 centimeters, we're aligned on the Y. So I'll just come into the top view. You can see that this isn't aligned on the X. So I just want to make sure that I'm in model mode. And I'm going to select the face spline. And I'm just going to pull this over. And I'm just going to hold shift for increments. And just so it's in line with our geometry there. And that's pulled over by 25 centimeters. I'm just going to pop into the side view again. I'm going to select both of these splines and I'm going to right click and say connect objects and delete. I'm going to come back into point mode. And with the rectangle selection, I'm just going to select these 2 points at the end here. Just come right in here. And now I'm going to use the world tool. And with the world tool, you can join at this end or at this end, but I'm just going to join these in the middle. And I'm going to bring back the face. I'm going to make sure that this is all aligned. And that's looking good there. Okay, so I'm going to come back into the default view here. And I'm just going to bring in a sphere, and this is going to be our ball. And I'm just going to pull this over a little bit so we can see what we're doing. So the radius I'm going to make 10. And the segments I'm going to say 32, just to smooth that out a bit. And I'm going to right click here. And I'm going to say animation tags align to spline. Now the align to spline tag is asking for a spline path, so I'm just going to drop my Penrose spline into there. But first I'm going to rename this. I'm going to call this track. And then I'm going to drop this into this spline path here. So I'm just going to bring this sphere down here and drop it underneath the track, so we've got the order operations there. So now with the spline tag selected, I can now change the position like so. But this is at the wrong end. I want this to start animating from this end down here. So I'm just going to make sure that I have my spline selected. Make sure I'm in point mode, right click, come to point order, and I'm going to say reverse sequence. So now it's starting at the end that we want. And that's good there. Just a quick note I forgot to mention, the spline that we created, just make sure that the intermediate points are uniform, because sometimes when you create your spline, it's going to default to adaptive. This isn't going to give you a smooth animation along the spline, so just make sure that this is in uniform here. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I want to make sure that this isn't intersecting with our geometry here. And the way I'm going to do that is I need to raise the ball up on the Y axis, and because the sphere is aligned to the spline, I can't change the value of the Y. It's going to be fixed to 125 centimeters or wherever it is. So what I need to do is I need to pop this into a null. So I'm going to make sure the sphere is selected. I'm going to Alt G, and now I'm going to call this null. All control. And now if I take the align to spline tag, drop that onto the null, I can now make some changes to the Y position for the sphere. So the radius is 10, so I'm going to make sure this is raised up by 10. And now if we come into the side view, we can see that when this animates along, this is now animating along the surface there. We're still going to have a problem, and the problem is that when we come around the corner, we're still going to be intersecting there, and that's because the null is still in the same orientation. So as we rotate around, it's not rotating with the curve there. So we need to come into the align to spline tag, and we need to make sure that tangential is checked there. So now when we animate, the ball is hugging the surface around the curve there, which is exactly what we want there. So far so good. So I'm going to come back into the default view here. What I'm going to do first is we're going to be making some changes to the spline here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create my keyframes first. So I'm going to make sure that I'm on frame 0, and I'm going to say this is 0 in the position. Make a keyframe and come to frame 360, and I'm going to say this is 100. Make a keyframe, and I'm going to animate this now. I'm just going to play this, and we can see here that the ball is animating along, and it's looking good. There's some strange things happening at this end here, but we're going to be deleting much of the spline at this end. But first of all, I want to make sure that the ball is traveling linear. And in other versions of Cinema 4D, just right click the position here, come to animation, show F curve, and then you can set your keyframes to linear. That's if you haven't got linear set as default. Because I've got my dope sheet here docked into my interface, I'm just going to open this up. So these are the keyframes for the last tutorial here. This is the align to spline keyframes. I'm just going to make sure these are selected. Both keyframes are selected there, and I'm just going to say linear. And so now when we animate this, the ball is moving at a constant rate as it comes around, like so. So what I need to do now is I need to work out how much of this spline I'm going to cut off here. So I'm just going to bring in, I'm just going to make a copy of my face here, and I'm just going to come into the camera view here, make sure I'm in model mode, and I'm just with this copy, I'm just going to change some values here, which is -90 on the H, -90 on the B, and this is 200 on the Y. So we're just going to play this. That's looking good. I just need to cut this end of the spline now so the ball isn't going to be showing as it comes around to the other side here. I'm just going to move my playhead back a bit to something about that. So I'm just going to come into my position here. So that's like 83%. So we come into the front view. We can see here where the ball actually is. And all depending which face you've got, you're going to have different angles of the faces, etc. We need to make sure that this ball is actually hidden by the geometry here. So I'm just going to pull the playhead forward a little bit to where the ball is safely hidden, and I think that's round about here. Just maybe one more frame, just about there. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to select the track here and come into point mode, and with the live selection I'm just going to select some points here. So this is around about here, so I'm just going to select these here and pull out, and with the rectangle selection while holding shift I'm just going to increase this selection here. So we have all these points at the top here, and I'm just going to delete these. So now when we come down to the end here, this ball is safely hidden by this geometry. So I'm just going to come into the default view here, and we're just going to see how this works, just to make sure that we made the right selection here at the end. And as the ball comes round, gets hidden and then it's not showing. So because this ball is being hidden by this piece of geometry, this will be the same with the other faces when we duplicate it. So what I want to do now is I want to rotate this ball to make it look like it's rolling along this surface here. So what I've done is I've already created a material here, and this is just a basic Cinema 4D material. And in the colors channel, I've just added a checkerboard. I just changed the values of the UV frequency to 2. I'm just going to drop that onto our sphere. And now when we press play, you can see the ball isn't rotating. It looks like it's on the travelator. So I want to rotate this. So to work out the rotation, I know that the ball will rotate 360 degrees as it moves down this spline here, but I need to find out how many times it will rotate. So I need to find out the frequency of rotation of the ball. So the two bits of information I need is how long is this spline and what is the circumference of the ball here. So we'll just come to the side view here. So this is the circumference of the ball, which we know on rotation is going to be 360 degrees, but we need to know what the value is. So what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to come into the track here, the track spline, and if I come to the mode and select project info, we're going to have all this information about the spline. So we know it's one object and we know there's 736 points. If we come to the structure, we can find out what the length is, and the length is 504.433. So I just made a note of that. So now we need to find out what the circumference of the sphere is, and the easiest way to find out the circumference of the sphere is to use a little bit of math, and we know that the radius is 10 centimeters. So the equation that you need is pi times the diameter, and we know that the radius is 10, so the diameter is 20. So we need to times pi, which is 3.14, by 20, which is 62.8. Now to find out the frequency of rotation, so how many times it's going to rotate along this spline, so we need to divide the spline, which is 504.33, divided by 62.8. And that would give us a frequency of 8.03237261. We need to round this down, which is going to be 8 rotations. So anything after the point is going to be very minuscule, so we're not going to see any difference. So I'm just going to say there's 8 rotations of the ball as it moves along the spline. So let's come back into the default view here. So I'm going to make sure I selected my sphere and come to the coordinates, and I'm just going to come back to frame 0. So I'm going to set the rotation, which is on the P. I'm going to say that's 0 degrees. If I come to frame 360, I know one rotation is 360, so I'm going to put them 360. I'm going to times that by 8. So that will give us a figure of 2880. Okay, I'm going to set a keyframe. I'm going to deselect everything at the moment, and we're going to see what this looks like. So now we see that the ball is actually animating the wrong way, and we just need to come into the sphere, come to the coordinates, and we're just going to make sure that we are rotating into the negative. So I'm going to say this is minus 2880. Refresh this keyframe. And now as we play, we can see that the ball is rolling at the right rate. We need to make sure that this is linear to match the animation along the spline. So I'm just going to come back to my dope sheet here, and I'm going to make sure I have my sphere selected. Both these keyframes are selected, and I'm going to say linear. I'm going to hide my dope sheet now. So as we play, this is animating at the right rate. It doesn't look like it's slipping, and this is looking good. So now we have our ball animation set up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this animation on each of the faces here. So I'm just going to delete the copy of the face that we created, and I'm going to create a null. Just get my fat fingers working again. So I'm just going to call this null face ball animation. Okay, so now I'm going to drop my face, my track, and my ball control null, which has my sphere in it, which has the animation applied. So now I'm just going to make some copies. I'm going to make 2 copies, and the first copy I'm going to change the rotation on the H by -90, -90 on the B, and 200 on the Y. And on the second copy, I'm going to make sure this is 90 on the P, 90 on the B, and -200 on the X there. So now when we play this, we have a ball rolling on each of these faces here, which is looking pretty cool. So when we come to the end of the keyframes here, you can see that we have a problem. This ball here isn't covered by any geometry. And if we come out of the camera and have a look, we can see that this ball here isn't covered by any geometry. So what we need to do is, when we render this out, we need to render out a Cryptomatte, and then we can composite this in After Effects. So I'll be showing you that in the render settings for Redshift and Octane. And when you render out a Cryptomatte, it's different. It's a different process for Redshift, and it's a different process for Octane. So I'll be showing you all that. Okay, so now that you have the basics of how to animate something along these faces, you can apply this to almost anything. So I'm just going to come back into the camera here and just let this play again. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to be popping into Redshift and I'm going to be showing you how to light your scene. With an open scene like this, I like to use an HDRI. But if you haven't got like a decent HDRI that gives you enough contrast with lights and shadows, then you can actually create the same kind of effect with area lights. So I'm going to be showing you that as well. And also I'm going to show you how to render out your Cryptomatte for Octane and Redshift. And we shall be putting this together at the end of the tutorial. We're going to be putting this together into After Effects. So I'm going to show you how to create a mask, and also I'm going to show you how to create some adjustment layers with the Cryptomatte. So let's crack on. Okay, so I'm just going to go through some things in Redshift, and the first thing I'm going to do is just go through the isometric projection in the camera for Redshift. And this camera here is the same camera that I used in the first tutorial, and it's also the same camera I used in the first part of this tutorial. So this kind of works right out of the box here. So I've got my Redshift Renderview docked here, and I'm just going to turn that on. So at the moment we've just got our default lighting on here, and this is the same view that we have in our viewport here. So the camera really works right out of the box with Redshift. So I just added the Redshift camera tag to this camera here. So I'm just going to go through quickly how to set this up. I showed you in the first tutorial, but I just want to remind you how this works with Redshift and how we set the camera up. So I'm just going to come out of the view here of the camera, and in the viewport I'm just going to make sure that I am in the default view. So I'm just going to make sure I'm frame default, which I am, and I'm just going to create a camera. So this time I'm going to create a Redshift camera. This is going to be a standard camera, and I'm just going to turn this on, and nothing happens at the moment. So with this camera, I'm just going to come to the physical camera here, and I'm just going to change the projection from perspective to isometric. Okay, so everything disappears. So we just need to get the geometry back into the center of our composition here. And the easiest way of doing that is to press H, or you can use the tools at the top of your viewport here. I'm just going to press H, and now this is our view here. So Redshift's now just caught us up, so it's exactly the same view. And there's a couple of ways of doing this. You can actually use these tools and scroll in to get this centered up, or you can just come to the camera and just change the zoom and just pan this around a little bit so it's in the center of our composition. So something like that. So that's how you set up an isometric projection with a Redshift camera. It's dead simple, works right out of the box. So I'm just going to go through my lights now. Okay, so at the moment this is the default lighting, and I just want to point out that I actually added a background to our object here, and this background is actually a plain object. So I just named that BG for background, and I'll position that underneath our model there. And if you're using an HDRI, this is going to help cut out some of the light from the HDRI, and also it will add a little bit of global illumination to our model here. So we're going to get some color bleed, etc. into our model. So it kind of like adds a little bit more realism to our render there. And also when we create our Cryptomatte later, then we can create a mask out of this, and then we can make some adjustments to the background as needed. Okay, so I'm just going to come back into our, so I'm just going to come back to the isometric render view here. So this is the default lighting, as I said, and I've set up some lights already. I'm just going to show you the dome light first. So this is with my HDRI. And for open scenes like this, I like to use an HDRI, and I've got access to some really nice contrasty studio lights that I've got from Grayscale Gorilla. So I'm just going to switch this on, and we get this nice light here, which is really cool. So this is just with an HDRI. So I'm just going to show you what type of HDRIs I like using. And if I just come into the dome light here, just come to texture, and I want to locate the image. I just want to show you the thumbnail. This is the EXRs there. And if I just come to the thumbnails, so these are really cool HDRIs, and this is like the studio metal from Grayscale Gorilla there, and these two are my favorite. So these create some nice contrasty lights and shadows, and this is the one I'm using right now. I really love this one, and this one too. It depends on my scene, etc. But this works really well with the Penrose Triangle. So this is the one I'm using at the moment. If you haven't got any access to anything like this, then you can actually create something very similar with area lights. So I'm just going to switch this off here, and I'm going to turn the camera off. I just want to remind us what this object looks like. So because we're looking at this through an isometric view, this isn't our traditional object that we're lighting, and we need to position the lights so that we can get each face here lit properly here. So this isn't a traditional scene where you maybe you want to highlight a hero object and draw their viewer's eye into the center of the scene. This is a very different way of lighting, and I actually use 5 lights to light this, and I had to position these around the model, and I kept the lights on a very low intensity so that when they all work together they light the object nicely. So I'm just going to go through where I position the lights and what the settings were. So I'm just going to come to the camera here. I'm just going to switch this on, and I'm going to come to the top view first in the viewport here so we can see where I'll position these. So the first light is an overhead light, and I'm going to switch that on, and this is lighting the top face here. If we just come out of the camera, you can see that this is lighting everything from the top there. So just come back into the default view here, and I'm just going to move this around so we can see. Just come to frame default. It'd be easy to move around there. Okay. So now we can see that this light is actually lighting from above, and this is face that is lighting here. So we just come back into the camera here. You can see that this is being lit quite nicely, and we've got a small bit of light coming onto the other faces there. And this light here is 662.6 squared. Okay, so I'm just going to come to the top view here, and this is positioned over our model like so. Okay, so that's illuminating quite nicely on our face there. I'm just going to turn this one off. I'm going to show you them one by one. So the next light is the backlight, and this is lighting this face here. If you come out of the camera, you can see that this is positioned at above and slightly at an angle looking down, and this is lighting this face just here. We come back into the camera, and that's looking quite nice there. So this light is the same size as the overhead light. This is 662 times 662, and the intensity is 1. And I forgot to say the intensity for the overhead light was 1.4. And the next light, I'm going to switch this one off, and the next light is the right light, and come to the top view, and this is over here to the right of the model. I'm going to switch this on. So this is lighting this face here. Okay, and this is with an intensity of 1, and this light is 418 by 418. And then the front light, I'm just going to turn this one off. The front light is right down here, and this is just illuminating from the front here, and I'm going to turn that on. And we've got some nice rim light going on there. You can turn this up a little bit, but I just kept this at an intensity of 1. I think that works really well, and the size of that light is 418 by 418. And this is positioned like so. So that's lighting the object from this direction here. I did add a left light, and this adds a little bit of rim light to our balls here. Okay, so I'm just going to pull out a little bit. So this one is 418 by 418 and this is an intensity of 1, and this is just adding a little bit of rim to this edge here and to these balls here. So I left the intensity very low because these lights are actually going to be working together, and I'm going to switch them all on and we can see how this is lit, and this is looking quite smart, and we get this nice gradient going on in the background here, which we don't get with the HDRI. Okay, so that's a quick run through with the lighting there. So we get a very similar look to the HDRI when setting up the lights this way. So it may seem a little bit overkill, but you get some nice balanced lighting on each of these faces here. As I said, the lights work together, so just keep the intensities low. So you can actually play around with these lights yourself, just move them around, just change the intensity, just like experiment with it. Just get some different looks for your impossible triangle. So it's up to you what you want to do there. So this is how I set my lights up. I just kept everything really basic. I haven't sort of like changed the color temperature of the lights, etc., but you can just play around with that. Also, you can add some texture to your lights and get some different variations in your reflections and shadows there. Okay, so that's basically how I set up my area lights for this scene. So now I'm just going to go through some render settings. Let's just come back into our view here. So I'm just going to go through some render settings here, and in the output, this is 1920 by 1080, 30 frames per second. I'm rendering all frames, self-explanatory. In the save, I'm just saving this as a PNG 16-bit. Okay, that's all I'm saving in the save tab here. And if I come to Redshift, I'm just going to be using the basic rendering here. So you can just set your bucket quality from low to very high, or just make it custom. And I'm just going to be using the basic. I don't need to go in depth and find noise in shadows and lights, etc. So I'm just going to keep this very basic, and I'm just rendering this as high. Everything else is as default there. So that's basically the render settings there. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be rendering out a Cryptomatte as well. So I'm just going to come into the Redshift AOV manager, and I've already got that set up here. Okay, so when you want to do your multi-passes, you can just bring any of these in your global illumination, default diffuse lighting, and your reflections, etc. So that's if you're doing like a 32-bit linear workflow, but this is very simple. I'm just using a Cryptomatte, so I've dropped a Cryptomatte in here, and by default it will say multi-pass and direct. So when you drop this in, you need to uncheck multi-pass. We're going to be saving this direct, so what this is going to do is going to save the Cryptomatte pass into our folder that we set up for our PNG sequence. So just leave direct check there. So I'm just using ID type Materialname, and I'm just going to open up my material manager here, and let's just pull this out a little bit. So I've created 3 materials for the balls and 3 materials for the faces and 1 for the background here. These are all different names. So you got the red stripes, stripes 1, stripes 2, and then hickory, planks 4, etc. there. So these materials have different names. So the candy red stripes is, if I just come to the sign, is sphere 1. The stripes 1 is sphere 2. I probably should have named that a bit better, but stripes 2 is sphere 3. Okay, so, and then the same with the hickory wood planks. These are named different here. I probably could have named these better as well, but this one here is the face, this one is face 2, and this one is face 3. But the point is that these materials have different names, and these names are going to be the identifier for creating our Cryptomatte. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to close this for the moment. Okay, and I'm just going to come into the bucket rendering, and I just want to do a render here of this, and we're going to see what the beauty looks like, and I'm also going to show you what the Cryptomatte looks like. Okay, so that's rendered and that's taken 1 minute and 30 seconds. Okay, so that's with the beauty and the Cryptomatte there. And the beauty is looking pretty cool. I'm really liking that. And I'm just going to come to this drop down menu here. So we've got beauty selected at the moment. I'm just going to change this to Cryptomatte. And this is the Cryptomatte. So it's assigned a different color to each of these objects. And this is going to help us create masks and adjustment layers in After Effects. Okay, so I'll be showing you that later. So this is 1.5 minutes for a render. If you want to see my specs for my PC, that's in the description of the video. I'm just using a single 2080 RTX graphics card, but if you want to see exactly what I'm using, just pop to the description of the video. So that's basically it. So what we're going to do is I'm going to render this out and then we're going to bring this into After Effects later. Okay, so now I'm going to show you some things in Octane, and the first thing I'm going to do is show you how to create an isometric view with a camera in Octane. So this camera here is the same camera that I set up at the beginning of the last tutorial and the same one I used at the beginning of this tutorial. So I've got my Octane live viewer here into my interface and I'm just going to turn that on. So as you can see, this isn't like Redshift. So this is the actual view that Octane is seeing, and this is what Cinema 4D is seeing. So now we need to create an isometric view in Octane. So the isometric projection in the camera isn't going to work in Octane. So we need to do something completely different. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new camera. So I'm going to switch this one off. And I'm going to make sure that we're in frame default here. So I'm just going to come to the view here, just click frame default, and we are. So this is the default view of our impossible triangle here. And this is being reflected in Octane. Okay, so I'm going to come to the live viewer studio here, and I'm going to come to the objects tab and create an Octane camera. And I'm going to switch that on. So with the Octane camera, we can't come into the object tab and change the projection to isometric. It's not going to work. We need to do something different. So I'm going to come to the coordinates here and I'm going to change the values on the rotation. So 45 degrees is correct. We need that to be 45 degrees. And if I come into the P, I can change this to minus 35.264. So now we get this completely different view here. The other thing we need to do is come into the Octane camera tag, and if we come to the thin lens tab, I'm going to keep the camera type to thin lens, but I'm just going to check the orthographic view here. So this is going to give us another perspective here in Octane, which doesn't reflect what we got on our viewport here. So this is exclusively looking through the Octane camera. The other thing I need to do is I need to move this model around so that is at the right angle. So instead of moving the model, I'm just going to put the camera into a null object. So I'm going to create a null, and the coordinates are 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Okay, so this is bang center in the middle of our scene here. And I'm going to change the name to camera. To camera control. So I'm going to drop our Octane camera into the null there. And now with the null selected, I can actually make some changes to the H rotation. So I'm just going to move this 90 degrees. And now we have our isometric view in our Octane camera. So I'm just going to move that into the center of our scene. And as you can see, that we've got isometric view here, but we haven't got that in our viewport. Also, when we try and scroll in, it's scrolling in on our perspective view here in our viewport, but it's not in the Octane. So what we need to do is we need to go into the Octane camera here. We just need to change the projection from perspective to parallel. So now we have the same view in our viewport as we do in our live viewer here. So now we can actually just scroll in, or we can actually just change the zoom in the camera. And then we can just position this in the middle of our composition. And that's looking great there. So So that's how you set up a isometric view with an Octane camera. It's dead simple. So I added a plane object to our scene here. So this is acting like a background. So we'll just come to the front view. You can see where I'll position this. So I'll position this down here underneath our model here. That's going to help cut out some light from our HDRI. So also it's going to add some color bleed from our global illumination. And also when we create our Cryptomatte later, we'll be able to isolate the background and make some adjustments in After Effects. That's that for the background. I'm just going to come into our default view here. And at the moment, this is default lighting. Okay, so I'm just going to switch on my HDRI. So I just added an HDRI environment into our scene and just added an HDRI into our tag here. So we'll just come into here. So this is what I have piped into that. So I'm just going to show you these in my folder. These are studio lights that I got from Grayscale Gorilla, and these are the thumbnails, and these work great. This is the Pro Studios Metal collection from Grayscale Gorilla. These are really great for open scenes. These two here are my favorite. You can get some nice contrasty lights and shadows with these. This is the one I'm using right now. If you haven't got HDRIs like these, then you can get a very similar look using area lights in Octane. So I'll set some lights up, and this is a very similar setup to the Redshift here. I'm going to switch off the HDRI. So this is switched off now. So we're back to the default flat lighting there. These are my lights that I set up. Now with Octane, if I just switch a light on, we're still going to have the default lighting in this scene, and I like to have more control over how I set up my lights. So I want to turn off this default lighting, and I'm just going to switch this light off here. So I added a texture environment into my scene, and this has got an RGB spectrum in the tag here, and I just set this to black. Okay, so I'm just going to switch this on. And also I just made sure that this is primary environment. So this is controlling all the lights in the scene here. So if we come into the tag and just come into our RGB spectrum shader here, we can actually change the values here. So we can get some different values for our lighting here. So this is a very good way of actually adding some ambient light into a scene, but I'm just going to switch that off completely. So if you think of black is off and white is on, that's how this works. So now I have more control over my lights when I'm setting this up. So the first light I want to go through is the top light, and this is, if I come to the top view here, you can see that I positioned this over my model light so. And this is looking down onto our scene. And I'm going to switch this on. And this is lighting the top of our model here. So this is going to be a different way of setting up lights than the traditional way of setting up lights. Like if you have something in your scene that you want to draw the viewer's eyes to, where you're using like 2 or 3 lights to do that. I'm actually using 5 lights, and we need to position these so these are lighting each of the faces here. So I will just come out of the camera. We can actually see what this looks like without the isometric view, okay, because we're actually viewing this through the camera with an isometric view, and you can see here that this is a very, very different object to say like a vase in a scene, etc., or a product, etc. So we need to position these so that we are lighting each of the faces here. Okay, so I'm going to come back into my camera view here. And that's the top light here. And this is a very good technique of creating lights in the scene. If you actually solo these one at a time, you can see exactly where you're lighting. So I'm just going to go through the details of the top light here. Okay, so this is 552 by 552. And I made the power or the intensity 1.4. So I'm keeping the values in these lights very low because these are actually going to be working together. So I don't want to be like overlighting one area where it's going to affect another area, because these have to work together. So I'm keeping the power down low. So I'm just keeping the temperature as neutral. And also with these lights, you can actually add a texture so that you can get some variation in your reflections and your shadows there. But I'm just keeping this light as 1.4 because I want it to work with the other lights. I don't want it to be overpowering them. So I'm going to switch this off, and I'm just going to come to the backlight here. If I come to the top view here, this backlight is situated like so, and this backlight is 677 by 418, and the power is 0.2. It's very, very low. Okay, I'm going to switch this on, and you can see what this is lighting here, and this is very, very subtle. And that's basically it for the backlight. Kind of position this at an angle. If I come to the side view here, you can see here that I position this at an angle. So this is kind of looking down at the model there. And if I come to the top view again, I'm going to come to the light on the right here. I'm going to switch that off. And this light on the right, if I just switch that on, is lighting this face here. And this light on the right, I made this 308 by 446, and this power is at 3. So this is a little bit stronger than the other two, but this is going to work well when we put this all together. Okay, so I'm just going to switch this light off, and the next light is the one on the left. This is looking straight over from the left. So the left light is 213 by 1152, and this is adding a bit of rim light to the balls and the edge here and to the corner here. And this power is 0.5, it's very low. And now to the front light, which is the light down here. The front light is 554 by 1152 roundabouts, and this is, if I just switch this on, this is adding a little bit more ambient light to these faces, and also some rim light to the balls and to this edge here, okay, and to this corner just here. And the power is 1. So if I just switch all these lights on, we can see how these work together. So I kept the power very low on the lights just so that they're not going to overpower each other, so they're working together. And this is what that scene is now looking like. You can probably add another area light for the background there, just to lighten that up a bit, but we'll be able to do that in After Effects when we bring that in, when we create our Cryptomatte. So that's basically the light setup. When you're setting up the area lights, just make sure a little goes a long way, just keep the power low. Solo them first, and just make sure that you're using the texture environment just to cut out the default lights, and you can see exactly where you're lighting your scene. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through some render settings, and if I just open up my Cinema 4D render here, I'm just going to go quickly through this. So the output is 1920 by 1080, 30 frames per second, rendering all frames. Not a lot to see here. In the Save tab, I'm just saving this into a folder of my choice, obviously, and this is a PNG, and this is going to be 16 bits. So I'll just come into the Octane render here, and I'm just leaving everything as default there. I'm just going to come straight to the render AOV group, and I'm enabling this because I want to render out an EXR Octane. So I'm going to enabling this, and I'm going to be saving my EXR into this folder here. I'm going to just leave this as 16 bits. Everything else is default there. And if I just open up my render AOV manager, you can see that I have my Cryptomatte already set up here. So I'm just going to be rendering out a Cryptomatte. So this is where you set up your different passes for your lights, etc. I'm just using a Cryptomatte, and I've just added that into here. So I'm just using the crypto type material node. I like using this because it's a very simple way of, for a small scene, it's a very simple way of setting up your Cryptomatte. With the material node, if I just open this up a little bit here, these are my materials and they have different names. Okay, I could have named these a little bit better, but I've created 3 materials for my spheres. So this material here, the candy red stripes, is, if I just come to this sign here, is sphere 1, this one is sphere 2, and this one is sphere 3. Okay, so they all have their different materials, and I've done the same with the faces here. So this is going to take this information and it's going to create our Cryptomatte. So it's going to assign a different color to our scene. So I'm going to be showing you that in a minute. And I just want to go through quickly. I'm just going to switch this off here. I'm just going to go through quickly our render settings in the Octane. Okay, so I'm using Pathtracing. Max samples is 2000. Diffuse depth is 10 and specular depth is 10. And I could probably get this a little bit lower, but I'm just going to leave that as it is. GI clamp is 10 and everything else is default there. So I have adaptive sampling checked here and I set the min samples to 128. So this is working earlier on in the render. So this took a minute for the beauty and the Cryptomatte there. I'm just going to show you the noise. So this is pretty much eliminated all the noise from our scene. So quite happy with the settings for the adaptive sampling here. And my render, so this is my beauty pass here, my PNG. And then if I come into the Cryptomatte, then you can see now that the Cryptomatte has assigned a different color to each of our objects here. So this is taking the information from our materials and it's assigning a color to each of the objects. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be taking this into After Effects and I'm going to show you how to use this. So I'm going to show you how to use this information to create masks and also adjustment layers so that we can composite this all together. Okay, so I jumped into After Effects and I'm going to show you how to composite our render together. I'm going to be showing you how to make a mask out of a Cryptomatte and also an adjustment layer. I'm going to be using my Redshift render and the process for this is exactly the same with Octane. I've just set up this project file here, so I've got a few folders here just to make sure I can organize myself. You can use any file structure you want as long as you're organized in your project window. Okay, so I'm just going to bring in my render. So I'm going to double click in my project window here. And this is my folder that will have my Redshift render in. And if you remember with Redshift, we had to save our Cryptomatte as direct. So this has saved our Cryptomatte in the same folder as our render here. Okay, so I'm just going to bring in my PNG sequence. So I'm going to select the first image and I'm going to make sure that PNG sequence is checked, and I'm not going to create a composition. I just want to bring this straight into my project. And the next thing I'm going to do is bring in my Cryptomatte layer. So I'm going to select my first EXR file of my Cryptomatte and I'm just going to again make sure this is a sequence and I'm not going to be creating a composition. So I'm just going to import this here. Okay, so now I've got the two things that I need. So let's have a look at the PNG sequence. So I'm just going to drop that into a comp. I'm just going to let this run and we're going to see what this looks like. Okay, that's looking quite smart there. So if you remember from our animation that this ball here isn't being covered by any geometry. So this is why we created the Cryptomatte, so we can create a mask to cover this up. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to organize my project window here. So I'm going to take the Penrose comp and I'm just going to drop that into my working comp. And I'm going to take both my PNG sequence and my Cryptomatte sequence and I'm just going to drop that into footage. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a composition for my Cryptomatte. So I'm just going to take my sequence and drop that into a comp. And as you can see that there's nothing there. I need to apply an effect to our Cryptomatte here. I'm going to be using my FX console, but you can use the effects tab over here, so you can just type in Cryptomatte. I'm going to use my FX console, which is a free plugin from Video Copilot. So I'm just going to open this up. So type in crypto and you've got Cryptomatte there. So I'm just going to apply that. So as I said, you can search for this over here in your effects tab here and just apply that onto your layer. So now you can see that our Cryptomatte is now showing. So these are different colors to what we saw in Cinema 4D, but we can still see that these are separate objects. And this is looking good. Okay, so everything's working there. So I'm going to take the composition here and I'm just going to drop that into my Cryptomatte folder here, and I'm going to rename this as I'm going to call this Cryptomatte master. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing is just making some duplicates from this one so that we can create our mask and adjustment layers. So we come back to our PNG sequence here and just scroll down here where we need to apply the mask, and you can see that this ball is showing here. So we need to make a mask out of this face here. So I'm going to call this the side face, and this face here is the front face, and this top one is the top face. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a mask for our side face. So I'm just going to take the Cryptomatte master here and I'm going to duplicate this. So I'm going to hold down Control D, and now we got our duplicate there. I'm going to take this duplicate and put that straight into our Crypto mask folder, and I'm going to rename this I'm going to call this side mask, and I'm just going to open this up. Okay, so I can close the Crypto Master tab because we're not using that now. So this is the side mask composition here. So I'm just going to select the face that I want. So I'm going to make sure that I select the layer, make sure the effect is selected there, and I'm just going to select this face here. And I need to change the output from colors to matte only. So now we have this black and white image here. So what this is going to do is we're going to be using Isometric to project our image into our mask here. If you think of this image as white is on and black is off. So when I project the image in here, only this part of the image will be showing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my PNG sequence. I'm going to drop this straight into my pre-comp here. And with my PNG sequence dropped in here, I'm just going to come over to the track matte and I'm just going to twirl this menu down and I'm going to select Lumimatte. So now we have our mask. So this, where the white area was, that's the only part of the image that's going to be showing. So let's come back to our PNG sequence here, and I'm going to take this side mask and I'm just going to drop that above my PNG sequence here. And as you can see that these balls here are showing. So if I just turn off my PNG sequence, you can see that we've got some intersection from the ball here in our mask. We don't want that. We want this to be nice and clean. So I'm just going to come back to frame 0, and now we don't have any intersections from our ball there. So I'm just going to make sure I've selected my side mask here. I'm going to right click and I'm going to come to time and I'm going to say freeze frame. So this frame is going to be the same all the way through our timeline here. So if I just turn my PNG sequence on and I'm just going to play this, and you can see that we have problems here, that this ball on the side face has disappeared. So what I need to do now is just change the in point for this side mask layer. So I'm going to turn that off for the moment, and I'm just going to scroll down our timeline here. I'm just going to get to the point just where our ball is going to be disappearing behind our mask. So just about here is fine. So with my side mask selected, I'm going to press Alt, open square bracket. So that's going to change the in point for our layer there. So if I just switch this on and we just play that again. Now our ball is fine here. And as it comes around just about here, it disappears again. Okay, so we need to do something else. So I'm just going to bring my playhead down to our layer here. Okay, so I'm going to make sure that it's beyond the in point there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a mask on our mask. Sounds a bit weird, but I'm just going to select the pen tool. I'm just going to draw a rough kind of square around here, and just that should do that. So now our ball has just appeared there. So I'm just going to turn off our PNG sequence, and we can see that this is the selection that we made of our mask. So let's switch the PNG sequence back on, and I'm going to make sure that this is covering the ball here. So I'm just going to bring this down to the end frame here, and you can see that's looking good. So that's looking pretty good there. So we have another slight problem. And if you can see just about here, there's a glitch. I'm just going to let this play again, and we're going to see the glitch. When we get to the end frame here, you can see that we got shadows and reflection there of our ball. And if we come back to our first frame, frame 0, you can see that we don't have any reflection or shadow just there. So we need to blend this in because we want this to loop. So the way we're going to do that is to create another mask. We're going to create a mask out of this face here. So what we're going to do is come into the Cryptomatte folder, and with the side mask selected, I'm going to create a copy. So I'm going to press Ctrl D, and now we've made a copy, and I'm going to rename this front mask. And I'm just going to double click this, and I'm going to open it up. And as you can see, that this is exactly the same as the side mask composition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off my PNG sequence, turn on my Cryptomatte here, and I'm going to make another selection. So I'm just going to come back to colors so we can see what we're doing. So now I'm going to select the front face here. And now I'm going to put this back as matte only. So now we created our new mask. I'm just going to turn off my Cryptomatte layer and turn on my PNG sequence, and just make sure my Luma matte is still on there. And now we have our new mask. So I'm going to come back to our PNG sequence here. So I'm just going to drop this into our Penrose composition here, and I'm going to make sure that this is on top. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn off these layers here, and if I scroll down the timeline, we can see that we got intersection of our ball again with our mask. So same thing, I'm going to make sure I'm on frame 0, and I'm going to right click the front mask layer, come to time, and I'm going to freeze frame. So now that frame is frozen, and if I just turn on my other layers, you can see now the ball has disappeared on the front side here. That's because the mask is masking it. So what we need to do is change the in point of this layer. So I'm going to turn this layer off, and I'm going to move my playhead down to a point where the ball has just disappeared. Just about there. Now I'll just turn my layer back on. I'm just going to press Alt open square bracket. And we're going to change the in point of that layer. And that's working, but we still have the same problem, is that the shadow and reflection abruptly disappears. So what we need to do is I'm going to change the opacity over time on this layer. So I'm just going to come to the end frame. I'm going to press T and open up my opacity, and then I'm going to set a keyframe for 100%. And if I just come back to the start at the in point of this layer, I'm going to change the opacity to 0. I'm just going to let this play from the beginning, and we're going to see what that looks like. That's looking great now. So if you just look at this area here, the shadow and the reflections just fade out, and then it loops back to the frame 0 and everything looks great. Okay, so now we have our looping animation. This is pretty much what I want to show you with the masks. The other thing I want to show you is how to use the Cryptomatte to make an adjustment layer. So looking at our composition here, I'm really liking this. I don't think I need to do much more. Maybe I need to change the curves a little bit, so just adjust the highlights and shadows a little bit. But I'm going to show you how to make an adjustment layer. So I'm going to say this front face here, I just want to darken this up a little bit, just so that we have more contrast between the different faces here. So I'm going to create an adjustment layer just for this side here. So what I'm going to do is, I've already created my masks. I'm just going to take the front mask here and I'm just going to duplicate it. So Control D. And I'm just going to drop this into my adjustment folder. And I'm going to rename this. I'm going to call this Front Adjust. And I'm just going to double click this and open it up. So as you can see, we've got the mask there. So I need to change this. So I don't need my PNG sequence in this pre-comp now. So I'm just going to delete this. Okay, so this is what we created for our mask. I'm just going to change this into adjustment layer. So I'm just going to come to the output and I'm going to change the matte only to matted RGBA, and that's going to change our image completely. So now we just have this side here showing. So I'll just come back into my main comp here with my PNG sequence. I'm going to take this front adjust pre-comp and I'm just going to drop that on top of our layers here. And as you can see, if I just let this play, so you can see here that this adjustment layer won't affect the ball. We're just going to be changing some values on this side here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come to my adjustment layer. We need to turn this into adjustment layer now. So if I come over to here, if you see these checkboxes here, with the checkbox with the circle that looks like a contrast symbol, just turn that on. And now we have an adjustment layer. So now I can just apply anything I want. So I'm going to use my fixed console and I'm going to say that I want to put a hue and saturation on. Okay, just for an example. So now I can just change the color of my front side there in my composition. So I can just move the master hue over and now I can make this kind of green. So this is the power of making adjustment layers out of a Cryptomatte. So I'm not going to be putting a hue and saturation on. I'm just going to delete that. That was just an example. I'm just going to apply a simple curves. Okay, and I just want to make this a little bit darker, so I'm just going to change the shadows here. Just bring that down slightly and just bring the highlights up a little bit. Maybe that's a little bit too much there. Just slightly, and I'm just going to toggle this on and off. That's looking good there. Okay, so that's all I'm going to do here. So this is looking quite smart. So we've used the Cryptomatte to create some masks so that we can composite the animation together, so it's looking exactly the way that we want it to. And also I've just made some adjustment layers using the Cryptomatte just to change some values on this side here. And that's pretty much what I want to show you. I want to keep this short and sweet, and hopefully this has been helpful for you, and I shall see you in the next video. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and what I've shown you is going to be useful for you in the future. If you made anything using this technique, then show your work. I'd love to see what you made. If you want to see my latest experiments and concepts, then pop over to Almost Daily Render on Instagram. Don't forget to like, subscribe and tinkle that bell for future content. And while you're here, you can check out my other content. And as always, any questions, comments, then please leave them below. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next video.